I didn't get 100% on Jean's test. Why? A 3-part podcast series. So maybe this was you when you got your results back on Jean's recent test in the Affective Relationships course. Or maybe your reaction was somewhat less dramatic. In any case, this 3-part podcast series is intended to help you figure out how to do better on upcoming tests in the ECE program. So welcome to Part 1. Where do I begin? First of all, remain calm and breathe through the nose. Easy for me to say, but very important when it comes to dealing with feedback on tests and other assignments. Next, after you've breathed through the nose, look over the test and this time concentrate on what you did well. A lot of you are used to looking at tests and only looking for the mistakes and concentrating on those. Sometimes we're too hard on ourselves, and I like to call this the red pen syndrome. We beat ourselves up over the mistakes that we made. But trust me, identifying what you did well will help you the next time, just as much as focusing on what you still need to work on. So look over that test again and concentrate first of all on what you did well. All right. Now even I have to admit that that's a lot of red pen, and you people know how much I love my red pen. But there is a way to read through all of the feedback that you get from your teacher on a test or on an assignment that will help you move forward with more confidence and do better on further assignments. So let's talk about feedback. Very basically, there are 2 types of feedback that teachers give. There's what is called summative feedback and there's formative feedback. And they are different and have different reasons for being on your test or assignment. Summative assessment is intended to indicate what you got right and what you got wrong. It's often expressed as a grade, either a number or a letter or a percentage, and often the feedback is in the form of ticks and X's, right and wrong. Formative assessment, on the other hand, is intended to help you do better next time, to continue to learn and develop. And formative assessment takes the form of comments, questions, suggestions, corrections, although all of that could still be in red pen. So, as you're looking over the test that you got back from Jean and trying to figure out how to do better next time, what are some of the usual suspects that the feedback could be about? Well, one of the problems could have been reading the questions on the test, and feedback on that could sound like, you seem to have missed the mark here. Sometimes the problem is understanding the content. What are the concepts and information? And feedback about that could be in the form of X's or could be, you have strayed from the point. Maybe mastery of a specific skill is what your downfall was on a specific question or test. And an example from our observing course of a specific skill could be descriptive writing. Maybe we need to go a little bit further back, and maybe it's listening in class that was the problem, or the notes that you've been taking, doing the readings, or maybe the way you've been doing the readings. Studying could have been a place where maybe more effort or more strategies were needed. Sometimes it's your answer itself and the examples you've chosen to illustrate your point, or the way that you have, or maybe not, expanded or elaborated enough on an answer. Sometimes it's even more basic than that, spelling, grammar problems that have made you lose marks, or the overall clarity of your written expression. This is a list of what I've called the usual suspects, things that students might struggle with that could lead to a lower mark or a lower success rate on an assignment or a test. So, part 1 of this podcast series will focus on reading the questions, understanding the content, and how to master specific skills. Part 2 will focus on the topics in yellow, and part 3, the third podcast, will focus on the topics in blue. So stay tuned for that. So, part 1, where do I begin? The first thing I'd like to look at is reading the questions. This is actually an important part of doing a test and can lead to lost marks or to a better mark on the test. So if this is you, when you first get the test, let's look at how we can use some more effective strategies, shall we? So, reading test questions, first of all, breathe, breathe, breathe. Take a moment to calm yourself down before starting to read any test or assignment. Secondly, look over the whole test. How many questions are there, and how long do you have to write this particular test? You don't need to answer the questions in order, and this is very important to keep in mind. You might consider first answering the questions you are sure you know the answer, or that you feel most confident about, or the questions that seem the easiest to you. Are any questions worth more marks than others? This is important to figure out before you begin and will help you establish your priorities when it comes to answering the questions. Also, try to identify what types of questions there are. Which questions are right answer, wrong answer type, and which are more of the bigger picture type questions. Thinking through all of these aspects of the test will help you come up with a rough timeline. How much time to spend on specific questions and where you can go more quickly. So, coming back to this suggestion that I had made, differentiate between questions that have a right answer and a wrong answer. In other words, those questions that required you to memorize specific information versus those questions that required you to demonstrate how well you understand certain concepts, can make links, things like that. So how do we do this? How do we differentiate between these two types of questions? On Jean's test, an example of the memorize type of question would be question number 4. And this is from Jean's test. List and describe the 5 key elements that contribute to establishing a positive interpersonal environment with all children. You will remember this. This was question number 4. This type of question has a right or wrong character, and Jean was looking for specific information, in this case, wager. Those are the 5 key elements. On the other hand, an example of the show what you understand type of question was question number 7. What are some pitfalls or mistakes to avoid when dealing with infants? You'll remember this. This was the last question on Jean's test. This type of question gets at the bigger picture, and Jean was giving you an opportunity to demonstrate your ability to use the concepts you learned about in class to make connections and answer this particular question. So differentiating between these two types of questions will help you prepare to answer these different types of questions. So now that we have looked at some tips for reading the questions, maybe we do need to take a step back. Maybe you lost marks because of how well you understood the content that was being covered on the test. So when it comes to this, what are some tips that I can give you for understanding the content? First of all, content, by that I mean facts, information, concepts, that aspect of what you've been learning in your classes. Remember my famous quote, there is no such thing as a dumb question. Only people who are too dumb to ask the question they really want to know the answer to. So ask those questions. Don't be shy to lift up your hand. Another tip I have for you is to compare your notes from class and what you've understood with other people that are taking the same class. Are you understanding the content in the same way? Are there gaps in your understanding? Have you taken notes that will help you to study? Another tip, take the quizzes in the textbook. Many textbooks, especially at the end of chapters, will have a quiz that you can take to help you see if you've understood the content. And this will help you review for the test. Or you could quiz each other. Have fun with this challenge of figuring out how well you've understood the content of any given course. You might also consider peer tutoring, which is a service that the ECE department offers. It's free of charge. It's tutoring that's done with a fellow ECE student, usually somebody in a year or two ahead of you, or somebody that's done very well in one of the courses. And if you are being tutored, you set the pace and decide what your priorities are in terms of what you'd like the tutor to focus on. So consider peer tutoring if understanding the content is something that you have been struggling with. All right, maybe it's mastery of specific skills. Maybe the feedback on the test has pointed you in this direction as an area of your learning that you need to work on. Now, mastery of specific skills, one thing I will tell you is that it requires practice. You will not become an excellent hallway diver like these two guys are without some heavy-duty practice. So, when it comes to mastery of skills, important to remember that skill is the ability to do something, the ability to apply knowledge in a certain context. And so, you need to practice. As I said before, practice makes perfect. How do you practice specific skills? Your textbook might have some exercises. So for example, in our observing textbook, there's always a section called Off on Your Own. You could again consider peer tutoring and get your tutor to give you some quizzes, to give you some practice drills so that you can practice the specific skills that are being covered in any given course. Also, think about how you learn best. For example, do you like to listen to a teacher talk? Is that a way that you learn best? Or do you like to observe someone else? Do you benefit from hands-on experiences? Or do you enjoy teaching others? These different learning styles and figuring out which ones are most familiar and comfortable for you will help you understand the content and master the skills that are required for the different classes. Think also about how time can factor into your preparation for any test and responding to feedback. Do you need time to think after you've learned about something new? Do you need time to practice over and over and over again a specific skill? Do you need time to integrate feedback into how you see your own success as a student and to respond to that feedback? These are all important questions. So, how can you, there goes the light bulb is going on. How can you move forward if you've identified reading the questions on the test, understanding the content, or mastery of specific skills at areas that you need to work on? What are some ideas? Well, in the specific case of Jean's test, I would suggest that you compare your answers with the answers that Jean has so kindly posted onto Omnivox. What are the differences in the answer you wrote and the answer Jean has supplied, and what are the similarities between those two things? This will help you identify maybe where some of your problem areas are and what some of Jean's feedback is intended to help you focus on. You might also want to compare your results and the feedback on a test with some of your peers. What did other people in your class get right? What did they do well on that maybe you didn't? And of course, remember, as I said way back at the beginning of this podcast, you also want to concentrate on what you did well and what you got right and share that with your peers. Based on your analysis of these two comparisons, identify what you need to work on. And you might want to go back in this podcast or stay tuned for the future podcast based on the results of your analysis and what you've identified as areas that you need to work on. Hive Mind is one of the features I'm going to have in each of these 3 podcasts. I've got the image of the beehive there because this is a section where you can learn how to harness the power of the collective. How can you and some of the other people in your group work together to do better and have better results on tests and other assignments? So, my Hive Mind tip for this podcast is to consider creating a review group. This would be a group that would meet regularly, for example, once a week or maybe less often than that. And what the group would do, you would compare your notes that you've taken in class. You would discuss the concepts that were presented in the class for that week or those weeks. You would ask questions of each other, all in an effort to seek clarification. And so this is really a good way to harness the power of you and your peers working together and to come up with some better understanding of the content and being better prepared for a future test or assignment. So that's the Hive Mind tip for this podcast. Remember that part 2 is coming up. The next podcast will focus on listening in class, note-taking, doing the readings, and studying strategies. So stay tuned for part 2 of this 3-part podcast series.